The Bozeman Trail in northern Wyoming Territory had killed more people by November of 1887 than anyone had bothered to count accurately. The graves along its length were not always marked, and the ones that were marked were not always found again after the first winter. It was the kind of road that took what it wanted and kept no records. Sigrid Ashford knew this. She had known it before she left Billings 6 days earlier, and she had known it every morning since when she climbed onto the wagon seat and pointed the mule south into a sky that had not yet decided what it intended to do. 31 years old, the daughter of a Norwegian shipwright who had built boats for fishermen on the Lofoten coast before crossing an ocean to start over in the Gallatin Valley of Montana, she was not a woman given to pretending that danger was something other than what it was. Her father had raised her without that particular kindness. On the morning of the sixth day, with perhaps 60 miles remaining between her and her brother's homestead, near Buffalo, Wyoming, she was standing on the wagon seat looking north at something that had no business being as large as it was. But we need to go back 6 days, because the storm was not the beginning of the story. The beginning was a room that smelled of tobacco and cured leather, and a man who did not stand up when she walked in. Virgil Mace was 52 years old, thick through the chest and shoulders, in the way of men who had done hard physical work for decades and then stopped. The muscle softened, but the frame still there underneath. He ran the largest trading post between Billings and the Wyoming line, and he had been running it long enough that he no longer needed to perform authority. He simply assumed it the way a river assumes the shape of its banks. When Sigrid pushed open the door to the back room of Mason Shawn's on the morning of November 1st, he was sitting behind a desk of black walnut that was wide enough to sleep on, and he looked up at her and did not rise. Her father had explained this to her once when she was perhaps 14, after they had visited a land agent in Bozeman who had done the same thing. He had said that a man who does not stand when a woman enters is a man who has already decided how the conversation ends before it begins. He said it not with anger, but with the flat precision he applied to all observations about human behavior, the same precision he applied to wood grain and tide tables in the set of a keel. It was information. What you did with it was your own business. Sigrid sat down across from Virgil Mace without being invited to, placed her hands flat on her knees and waited. The debt had been her husband's. Thomas Ashford had borrowed $430 from Virgil Mace 3 years earlier to establish a trading post of his own outside Billings at a location that made geographic sense and commercial sense and every other kind of sense except the kind that accounted for 2 consecutive drought years and a collapse in cattle prices and a diphtheria outbreak that kept 3 families from traveling any road at all for the better part of a summer. Thomas had been dead 8 months. The trading post had been closed for 5, and Sigrid had spent the weeks since then converting what remained of their shared life into cash money piece by piece with the methodical patience of someone who understood that grief was not a reason to stop doing arithmetic. She had the money, every dollar, counted out in advance, sitting in a cloth pouch she had kept pinned inside her coat since leaving the collapsed trading post because she had not trusted the roads, and she had not trusted herself to spend it on something other than what it was for. What she had not expected was the desk. Virgil Mace spread his hands on the walnut surface and told her that the wagon was collateral, that the loan agreement Thomas had signed specified physical assets as security, and that the wagon as Thomas Ashford's property at the time of signing fell within that specification. He said this in the tone of a man reading from a document that neither of them had written, as though the injustice of it, if there was any, belonged to the paperwork and not to him. Sigrid reached into her coat and placed the cloth pouch on the desk. She said the wagon had been purchased with her own money, a wedding gift from her father, and that she had the bill of sale to prove it. She said this without raising her voice and without breaking eye contact. And Virgil Mace looked at the pouch and then looked at her and said that documents of that kind were sometimes open to interpretation depending on the circumstances of a marriage and the disposition of shared property in the event of a husband's death. She understood then that the money was not the point. The money had never been the point. She had brought the toolbox with her. It was sitting on the floor beside her chair, a rectangular case of Norwegian pine fitted with iron hardware, the kind of thing that announced itself not by being decorative, but by being exactly what it was built to last by someone who knew how things were built to last. Her father had placed it in her hands the morning of her wedding without ceremony, without a speech, with only the look she had learned to read over a lifetime of watching him say important things without words. She lifted the toolbox from the floor and set it on the desk. Virgil Mace's eyes moved to it and stayed there for a moment that was slightly too long. And in that moment, Sigrid understood something that rearranged the entire conversation she thought she was having. He knew whose toolbox it was. Christian Dahl had been building boats in the Gallatin Valley for 11 years before his death in the winter of 1882. He was not famous the way politicians or generals are famous. He was famous the way a man becomes famous in a place where skilled hands are rare, known among people who worked with their hands and therefore knew the difference between a craftsman and someone who merely produced things. The tools he had brought from Lofoten were not available anywhere in the Montana Territory, and the work done with them showed it. Virgil Mace had offered to purchase the toolbox from Thomas 2 years before Thomas died. Thomas had refused without consulting Sigrid, which was one of the few decisions of their marriage she had agreed with completely. Virgil Mace leaned back in his chair and offered to help her. He could arrange a rider to escort her to Fort McKinney, he said. He knew people there. There might even be something for her in Billings if she was willing to stay, something respectable. Something that suited a woman of her particular capabilities, by which he meant a woman who clearly had more sense than most. All of this in exchange for the toolbox, which he described as a fair trade for a collection of old equipment that had sentimental value but limited practical use to a woman traveling alone. He said this with the smooth patience of a man who had made many similar offers over the course of his career and had a high success rate. Sigrid picked up the cloth pouch from the desk and began counting the money out in front of him. Coin by coin, bill by bill, stacked in two neat columns while Virgil Mace watched and said nothing. When she reached the full amount, she pushed both columns across the walnut surface toward him and stood up the toolbox in one hand. Virgil Mace looked at the money. He looked at her. Then he picked up a pen and signed the release of debt. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. Not loud, not threatening, just the voice of a man making a factual observation. He said that the Bozeman Trail in November was not a road for a woman traveling alone, and that he hoped she understood the risks she was taking, and that if she changed her mind before she left Billings, she knew where to find him. She walked out without answering. And Virgil Mace, when she was gone, set down his pen and called his assistant in from the front room and gave him a simple instruction. He said, "Find out which way she goes." What Sigrid did not know and would not know for 4 more days was that Virgil Mace had not made the offer out of opportunism. He had made it out of calculation. He had been buying Thomas Ashford's debts from other creditors for 18 months, purchasing them at pennies on the dollar from men who had given up on ever seeing payment. He had accumulated, by the time Sigrid walked into his back room, nearly the entirety of what Thomas had owed to everyone in the Billings area. He had done this not because he expected to be repaid, but because debt was a different kind of leverage than money. And when Thomas died and the trading post failed, and Sigrid began converting their assets, Virgil had been watching with the patience of a man who had learned that the best time to reach for something was when the person holding it was least able to hold on. The toolbox was worth more to Virgil Mace than the $430. Not because of the tools themselves, though the tools were exceptional, because he knew a man in San Francisco who collected Norwegian maritime instruments, a man who had more money than objects worthy of his attention, and who had expressed specific interest through an intermediary in acquiring pieces from the Lofoten workshops. Virgil had done a rough calculation and arrived at a figure that made the entire debt accumulation strategy worthwhile on its own. Sigrid did not know any of this. She knew only that something had been wrong with the conversation in a way she could not fully name, and that the sensation of being watched was still between her shoulder blades when she crossed the Yellowstone River south of Billings 2 days later. She had 6 days of road in front of her, roughly 140 miles to her brother Vidar's homestead near Buffalo. The mule was sound. The wagon was not entirely, but it would hold if she was careful on the crossings. The front axle had developed a crack somewhere outside of Billings, a hairline fracture she had discovered on the 4th morning when she crouched down with a lantern to check the running gear before dawn. She had examined it with her fingers in the lamplight, tracing the split in the wood, measuring its depth, against her experience of what wood did under stress and over time. It would last another few days if she avoided the worst of the frozen ruts. She filed this fact away in the part of her mind that kept track of things she could not fix yet. What remained on the wagon fit in a space smaller than most people's sleeping quarters. A canvas roll, 2 wool blankets, a cast-iron Dutch oven that had been her mother's and then hers, and that she would not have left behind if the wagon itself had been on fire. A leather satchel of dried elk meat and hardtack, a water barrel lashed to the sideboards, a 60-foot coil of braided hemp rope worn but sound, and the toolbox. She had not opened the toolbox since Thomas died. She knew exactly where it was at all times, and she had not touched the latch. This was not an inability to face grief. She had faced it every morning when she woke up in the bed that still held the shape of two people and now held only one. She had faced it in the accounting books, line by line, converting a shared life into a ledger she could close. What the toolbox represented was not grief exactly. It was the question of what came after, and she was not ready to answer that question out loud. Opening the box was a kind of statement. It meant she was starting something. She was not certain in those first months that she had enough left in her to start something. She thought about Thomas on the long straight sections when the mule moved at its own pace, and there was nothing to manage except direction. She thought about him with neither the softness of early grief nor the bitterness that sometimes followed it. She thought about him accurately, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. He had been a good man in the way that phrase means when it is said without qualification. Not good at making money, not good at reading weather or terrain or the direction a situation was moving, but good in the older and more fundamental sense of the word honest, without effort, generous, without accounting for it, and possessed of a belief in other people that had survived more evidence against it than Sigrid thought a reasonable person could absorb. He had believed the trading post would work because he believed the people who would use it were fundamentally decent, and that decent people could be counted on to show up when they said they would. He had been right about the people. He had been wrong about everything the people were up against. She did not blame him. She had understood somewhere in the middle of the second drought year that blame was a kind of debt itself, and she had no interest in accumulating more of either. On the fifth day, 2 miles north of Powder River, the sky did something she did not like. It was not the color. Color was the obvious thing, the thing everyone noticed first, and by the time you were reading color, you were already behind. What she noticed was the quality of the light, a flattening of it, a compression, as though the distance between her and the horizon had suddenly become smaller without anything actually moving. The mule noticed it too, not dramatically, not the way animals behaved in stories, but with a small adjustment of its ears and a slight shortening of its stride that she felt through the reins before she registered it consciously. She cataloged the observation and continued south toward Powder River. The trading post there was not much, a low building with a sod roof and a lean-to stable that had been added at a different angle than the main structure, giving the whole thing the look of something interrupted. But there was smoke from the chimney, and smoke meant someone was home, and Sigrid had learned in 6 days of solo travel that every human voice was worth a few minutes of road. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 45, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something permanent and precise. She was taller than average and moved with the economy of someone who had been doing everything herself for long enough that unnecessary motion had been eliminated entirely. She looked at Sigrid, looked at the mule, looked at the sky to the northwest, and stepped back from the door without saying anything. Her name was Nava Colston. She had come to Wyoming Territory from Minnesota 8 years earlier with a husband who knew cattle, and she had stayed after the cattle operation failed, and then the husband failed, the second failure being a fall from a horse in a ravine that no one witnessed, and that took 3 days to discover. She'd been waiting 3 weeks for a rider from Cheyenne who had been supposed to come in October and had not. She poured water without being asked. Then she sat down across the small table and looked at Sigrid with the direct assessing attention of someone who had spent years making quick decisions about what people needed and how likely they were to accept it. She said, "You are going south alone." Sigrid said she was. Neva said it was November. Sigrid said she was aware of that. They sat with that for a moment. Then Neva said that she had watched 2 riders from Sheridan come through 4 days ago, heading north, turning back, because they did not like what the western sky was doing. She said it without drama, the way a person states a fact they expect to be useful. Sigrid asked about the formations to the west, the sandstone bluffs she had been noticing for 2 days along the ridge, low and irregular, the kind of thing you stopped seeing after a while because it was always there. Neva looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone recalibrating an assumption. Then she got up and took a piece of leather from a drawer, a palm-sized scrap of cured hide, and sat back down and picked up a stick from beside the wood box. She drew the bluffs in relation to the trail, marking the ones with eastern-facing openings, noting the depth indicating the approximate distance from the main road. She explained the wind direction in any serious storm on that section of the trail, always from the northwest, which meant the eastern faces of the bluffs would be the protected side. She said she had spent 14 hours in one of those formations in the winter of 1881 with her husband and two ranch hands, two horses, and four people, in a space not much bigger than a large closet, and all four had walked out the next morning. Her father had been from Minnesota, she said, and his father had been Norwegian. She had grown up with certain ideas about cold and wind and shelter that she had once thought were specific to Scandinavian pessimism and had since concluded were simply accurate. Sigrid looked at the drawing. She had been seeing those formations every day and cataloging them the way she cataloged the cracked axle and the state of the road and the position of the sun, as useful features of the landscape, as three walls already built. She reached for the leather scrap and Neva let her take it. She was folding it into her coat pocket when Neva said with the same flat delivery she had used for everything else 2 days ago, a man came through from the north with 3 riders. He was a heavy-set man, older, who asked about a woman traveling south from Billings with a wagon and a single mule. Sigrid went still. Neva said she had told him she had not seen anyone matching that description. She said this without elaboration, and Sigrid understood that the elaboration was unnecessary. She asked Neva what the man had looked like. Neva described Virgil Mace with the accuracy of a witness who had been trained to observe, which, as it turned out, she had been. She had served as a field nurse with the Army of the Potomac for 2 years during the war and had spent a considerable portion of that time in situations where accurate observation was the difference between the useful and the useless. She had noticed the saddle on Virgil Mace's horse, specifically a strip of red leather behind the cantle, hand-stitched. Not standard issue, the kind of custom work done by a particular saddler in Billings, whose work she had seen once before. Clara sat with this information for the length of time it took to be certain she understood what it meant. Virgil had not accepted the settlement, or rather he had accepted it as a legal matter and rejected it as a practical one. He was 2 days behind her and moving south with 3 men, which meant he had made a decision about the toolbox that had nothing to do with debt collection and everything to do with the calculation she had seen in his face when his eyes moved to the pine case and stayed there too long. She did not say any of this to Neva. She thanked her for the water and for the information and for the leather scrap in her coat pocket. She asked if Neva needed anything that Sigrid had the means to provide. Neva said she was fine. She said it in the tone of someone who had been fine through conditions that would have broken a lesser definition of the word and meant it as a description rather than a dismissal. Sigrid went back to her wagon. She checked the axle by feel in the fading afternoon light, running her fingers along the crack, measuring it against where it had been 2 mornings ago. It was worse. Not catastrophically, not yet, but worse in the way that things got worse when they were getting ready to fail. She sat on the wagon seat for a moment in the cold and looked south and thought about 2 problems at once in the way her father had taught her, not sequentially but simultaneously, the way you read wind and tide together rather than one after the other. Virgil Mace was 2 days behind her. The sky to the northwest was doing something she did not like. She had 60 miles of road remaining. The axle was getting worse. She had 1 day of good weather, possibly less. She had 1 functional wagon, possibly less. She had a cracked axle, a coil of rope, a toolbox she had not opened in 8 months and 60 miles of terrain she could not see yet. She picked up the reins and kept going south. On the morning of the 6th day, with the sky flat and the wind gone and the mule reading the air with something beyond ordinary animal caution, Sigrid stood on the wagon seat and looked north and saw what she had been expecting and had hoped not to see. It was not a discoloration on the horizon. It was a wall, a dark mass of cloud that stretched from one edge of the sky to the other, its upper edge curling forward in a way that told her the front was steep and fast, its base smearing the land with a pale gray haze she recognized immediately. Horizontal snow driven at velocity, the kind of thing her father had pointed to from cliff tops when she was young and used as a lesson about why the fishing huts were built the way they were built. She had perhaps 2 hours, perhaps less. She looked west. The sandstone bluffs ran along the ridge low and broken a 1/4 mile off the main track. She had been passing formations like them for 2 days without stopping to examine them. She did not stop to examine them now either. She got down from the wagon seat, walked to the mule's head, placed her hands on either side of its face, and stood completely still. This was not calm in the ordinary sense of the word. Calm is the absence of agitation. What Sigrid was doing was something more active than that. She was forcing her attention to move at the correct speed, which was slower than her instincts were asking for. Her father had said that people died in the wild not because they moved too slowly, but because they moved in the wrong direction. And the wrong direction almost always came from moving before the mind was ready. She looked at the terrain. She assessed what she had. She thought about what she needed. Then she reached up and unhooked the mule from the traces, and she left the wagon where it stood on the exposed ridge, and she walked the mule forward toward the bluffs. Anyone watching from a distance would have thought she had lost her mind, not because she was moving too slowly, because she was not moving toward anything they could see. She had walked away from the wagon, which was shelter of a kind, however inadequate. She had walked away from the trail, which was direction of a kind, however exposed. She was leading a mule toward a broken line of low rock formations that from any reasonable distance looked like nothing more than the ordinary rubble of a high ridge, the kind of geological debris that accumulated over centuries without purpose or pattern. Any person watching her would have expected her to be scanning the horizon for a farmstead, a tree line, a gulch deep enough to crawl into. Instead, she was walking at a measured pace toward a pile of sandstone, and she was looking at the ground. She was reading it. The slope of it, the way the frost had settled differently on the eastern side of each formation, the small signs of wind deflection in the dead grass that indicated where moving air had been interrupted. She had learned this from her father the same way she had learned everything from him, not through formal instruction, but through proximity and attention, standing beside him, while he read a coastline or a timber yard and absorbing the method through the skin before she could name it. She passed the first formation without stopping. Too shallow the hollow, barely deep enough to shelter a sitting person, the opening facing northwest at an angle that would funnel rather than block any serious wind. She passed the second, better depth, but the wrong geometry, the walls converging in a way that would create turbulence inside rather than stillness. The third formation stopped her. It was wider than the others, perhaps 18 feet across the mouth, and it curved inward at the top and sides in a way that was not dramatic, but was deliberate in the way that geological processes occasionally produce something almost intentional. The hollow went back perhaps 6 feet into the rock at its deepest point. The floor was dry, protected by the overhang above from both rain and drifting snow. The walls on 3 sides were solid, unbroken, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with permanence. They were not going anywhere. They had not gone anywhere in 10,000 years of weather that made this November look moderate. And the opening faced east, away from the northwest wind that was coming. Sigrid stood at the mouth of the hollow for exactly long enough to confirm what she was seeing. Then she tied the mule to a scrub juniper growing from a crack in the sandstone, and she said one word to the animal in Norwegian, the word her father had used with draft horses that meant stay, and she ran. The wagon was 400 yards back on the ridge, sitting where she had left it fully exposed, the kind of target that a storm picks out from a distance and does not let go of. The light had changed while she was walking. The sickly yellow compression of it had deepened into something that was not a color so much as an absence. The landscape draining of depth, the way a face drains of color before something goes very wrong. The wall of cloud to the northwest had grown taller in the time she had been away from it, its upper edge pushing forward with a momentum that told her the front was steeper and faster than her first estimate. She ran the 400 yards in the kind of cold that turned breath to vapor before it left the body, and she arrived at the wagon without allowing herself to calculate how much time she had, because calculation of that kind served no purpose. She either had enough time or she did not. The only variable she controlled was how she used what she had. The wagon was a standard farm wagon, 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, with wooden sideboards 3 feet high. The canvas cover had torn loose in a crossing 2 days earlier, and now hung from the rear boughs in pieces that moved without purpose in the dying wind. The front axle was cracked, she already knew that. What she saw now that she had not fully registered before was the state of the left rear wheel, wobbling on a worn hub in a way that suggested it had perhaps one more serious crossing in it before it gave up entirely. One of the sideboards had split along its upper edge. The tailgate hung from a single hinge. No trader in Wyoming territory would have offered $10 for it. Sigrid did not see a wreck. She saw a wall. She could not move the wagon whole. Not without the mule, not in the time she had, and not over ground that had enough frozen ruts to make a loaded vehicle unpredictable. But she did not need the wagon whole. She needed the body of it, the bed, the sideboards, the structural box of the things stripped of everything that made it roll. She went to the front axle first, the cracked one. She found the linchpin, pulled it, and dragged the axle free. It came out more easily than she expected, the crack having spread further than her last examination had shown. The tongue dropped to the frozen ground with a sound that felt final, like closing something. She moved to the rear axle and repeated the process. When both axles were free, the wagon bed sat flat on the ground, a heavy wooden box open at the top and disconnected from everything that had once made it useful for its intended purpose. She stood back and looked at it. 300 pounds approximately of seasoned oak and pine sitting on frozen grass on a gentle downhill slope that ran west toward the sandstone bluffs. 400 yards of open ground between her and the only shelter that existed within a day's travel in any direction. She had the rope, 60 feet of braided hemp worn smooth in the middle, where it had passed through rings and over saddle horns and around fence posts across more years than she knew. But sound along its full length, no phrase, no weak spots she could identify by running it through her hands. She threaded it through the stake pockets at the front of the wagon bed, both sides, and brought the ends together in front and fashioned a harness across her shoulders and chest, crossing it twice over her sternum, checking the load distribution with the instinct of someone who had grown up watching a man fit rigging to boats for fishermen whose lives depended on nothing failing at the wrong moment. She leaned into it. The wagon bed moved, not easily, not quickly, but it moved, the bottom edge scraping across frozen grass with a sound like tearing cloth, leaving a dark scar in the frost behind it. What followed was 40 minutes that she never described in detail to anyone afterward, not because the memory was painful, but because the body's experience of extreme effort does not translate well into words. The rope bit into her collarbone through the layers of her coat. The ground was not as even as the downhill grade had suggested, and twice the bed caught on a frozen clump of earth and stopped completely, and she had to work the rope at an angle to break it free. Her hands stopped feeling like hands somewhere around the halfway point and became instead a set of functional attachments she directed by intention rather than sensation. The wall of cloud to the northwest was no longer on the horizon. It was above her now, the base of it closing with the ridge at a rate she could feel without looking directly at it, the light shifting from yellow to a dim gray-green that she associated from childhood memory with the minutes before a storm that had killed 14 men at sea off the Nordland coast, and that her father had spoken of exactly once and never again. She was out of time. She knew it with the certainty of someone who has run the calculations so many times that it no longer requires conscious effort. But she did not run. She did not rush in the way that leads to dropped rope and poor decisions. She moved at the fastest speed that was still controlled, which was the speed her father had always moved when things were serious, and she covered the last 100 yards with a focus so narrow that everything outside of what she was dragging and where she was dragging it ceased to exist. The hollow was just wide enough, not perfectly wide enough. The wagon bed at 10 feet did not span the full 18-foot opening, and the gap it left on each side was the kind of gap that would undo everything if she allowed it to remain. She dragged the bed into position with the sideboards facing outward, creating a barrier 3 feet high across the center of the hollow's mouth. Above the sideboards, between the top edge of the wood and the rock overhanging above, there was open space. She looked at it and made no calculation about whether this was enough or not enough, because that calculation was finished. She had what she had, and she would work with it until the storm arrived, or until she ran out of things to work with, whichever came first. She pulled the torn canvas from the rear bows of what had been the wagon and stretched it across the upper opening. The material was damaged, a long tear along one side and several smaller punctures from the crossing that had broken it loose, but there was enough of it, and she had rope. She weighted the top edge with stones pulled from the base of the rock face and tied the bottom edge to the sideboard stakes with short lengths cut from her coil, working the knots by feel because her fingers were past the point of fine sensation. The canvas did not fit perfectly. It billowed in places, gapped in others. The tears let in light, which meant they would let in wind. She turned to the slope below the bluff. The grass there was knee-high brown and brittle and dead since September, but still rooted in the frozen soil and thick enough to gather by the armful. She gathered it. She stuffed it into the gaps between the wagon bed and the rock walls on each side, the spaces where the 10-foot bed left 8 feet of opening unaddressed and where the wind would find its way through as easily as water finds the lowest point in a basin. She packed the grass tight, handful after handful, pressing it into every crevice until no light showed through. She stuffed more grass into the tears in the canvas. Where the canvas gaped near the top, she unpinned the first of her 2 wool blankets from her pack and hung it across the upper gap, wedging the corners into cracks in the overhang with stones. At the base of the wagon bed, where the uneven ground left irregular spaces between the wood and the frozen earth, she scraped loose soil from the floor of the hollow with both hands and packed it against the lower edge of the wood like mortar against stone, pressing it flat, building it up, sealing the line where shelter met ground with the same attention she had given to every other inch of the barrier. Then she stopped and looked at what she had built. It was not beautiful. It was not impressive. In a different context, it would have been difficult to explain what it was at all. A broken wagon bed jammed into a rock formation and sealed with dead grass and a borrowed blanket and packed dirt. Half the materials were damaged before she used them. Nothing had been designed for this purpose. Nothing had been built to last. She reached into her coat and felt the leather scrap from Neva Colston. She had not thought about it during the construction. She had not needed to. But she thought about it now, about Neva's hands on that stick drawing, without hesitation marking the eastern faces of the formations, as though she were describing something she had visited recently and expected to visit again. Neva had said 3 walls already built. You build the 4th from whatever you have. She had not said it would be enough. She had said it would be the difference. Sigrid went and got the mule. This was not sentiment, and she would not have wanted it described as sentiment. She had done the arithmetic in the first minutes after she saw the hollow, and the arithmetic was straightforward. A mule at rest generated heat at a rate equivalent to a modest stove. In an enclosed space the size of the hollow, that heat would matter over the course of a long night in a way that was not trivial. The presence of the animal was a thermal asset, and leaving it outside the shelter was a waste of a resource she could not afford to waste. She led it through the gap she had left at the right end of the wagon bed, pulling its head down under the rock overhang, coaxing it sideways through the narrow space between wood and stone. The mule resisted for a moment with the particular stubbornness of an animal that understood something was wrong with its environment and was not yet certain that the alternative being offered was better. She spoke to it in Norwegian again, not the word for stay, but something else, something closer to the word her father used when he wanted an animal to trust him with something it could not understand. The mule went through. She sealed the gap behind it with the second wool blanket and more grass packed as tightly as her hands could manage. Her hands were functioning, but she was working mostly by pressure, now reading the resistance of the material through the palms rather than the fingertips. The space inside was dark in the way that natural darkness is dark completely and without gradation, with no point of reference to orient the eye. It smelled of sandstone and dry grass and the particular animal warmth of the moss pressing its flank against the back wall. And something else, something she noticed only after the other smells had settled into the background. A mineral smell, deep and cold and ancient, the smell of rock that had not been open to weather for a very long time. She felt her way to the back wall and sat down. She put the leather satchel on her lap. She felt the outline of the toolbox beside her where she had left it at the start of the construction, having moved it inside early on, without thinking much about it. Her fingers found the latch and rested there. She opened it. She did not take anything out. She did not need anything from it in that moment. She opened it and ran her fingers across the tops of the tools in the order her father had always kept them, feeling the shape she had known since childhood, the draw knife and the marking gauge, and the set of chisels graded by width, each in its fitted recess, each exactly where it had always been. He had never rearranged them. She had checked in the months after his death, expecting to find something different, some evidence of the last time he had used them. Everything was in its place. She sat with her fingers on the tools in the dark and understood something she had been refusing to understand for 8 months. Her father had known, not about the hollow, not about Virgil Mace or the cracked axle or the storm bearing down on this particular ridge on this particular November morning. But he had known that a day like this was coming. Not as a prophecy, as a probability. He had lived long enough and watched carefully enough to understand that the life of a woman alone on the frontier in 1887 would produce eventually a moment when everything else had been stripped away, and what remained was only what she carried in her own hands and her own head. He had not tried to prevent that moment. He had prepared her for it. He had taught her about wind and walls and the physics of surviving cold, not as a lesson about cold, but as a lesson about the nature of shelter itself, about the difference between waiting for protection and building it. He had given her the tools not as equipment, but as a statement of confidence in what she would do when the time came. He had trusted her not because he was certain she would succeed, but because he was certain she was prepared. And to a man who had built his life on the principle that preparation was the only honest response to uncertainty, those were the same thing. She closed the toolbox. She had been crying without being aware of it. Not from grief. The tears had come from somewhere past grief. From a place that was not sadness, but was adjacent to it, the specific feeling of being understood by someone who was no longer there to be thanked. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and sat in the dark and listened. For a long time, there was nothing to hear but the mule's breathing and the very distant sound of the wind that had not yet arrived. Then it arrived. It did not come gradually. One moment the air was still, and the next it was not. And the transition between those two states was so brief that she could not have measured it. The sound that reached her through the walls of rock and wood and canvas and grasses was not the sound of weather in any ordinary sense. It was something larger than that, a sustained dimensional roar that she felt in her sternum, and through the rock at her back simultaneously, a sound with weight to it, with the physical quality of a presence, rather than just a phenomenon. The canvas snapped against its ties. The blanket at the upper gap pressed inward, billowed back, pressed again. The dried grass in the packed gaps hissed and rattled as air found the smallest available paths and forced itself through them in thin, cold streams. Snow began to appear inside the hollow almost immediately, not falling, but driving horizontally through the remaining imperfections in the wall, fine enough to hang in the air, before settling cold enough to sting briefly where it touched her face. She crawled forward in the dark to check the canvas ties. She found them by touch, verified the knots, found one that had slipped, and reworked it with fingers that registered the rope as a shape rather than a sensation. She worked the knot she could not see by the feel of the tension in the rope on either side of it, the way her father had taught her to tie in the dark when the weather was too bad to go out with a lamp. The mule stamped, once, twice. She heard it shift its weight against the back wall, and she said the Norwegian word again without thinking, the one that meant stay, and the animal went still. The first hour was the worst, not because of the cold, because of the sound. It was a sound designed to convince the listener that the walls were thinner than they were, that the gaps were larger than they were, that the structure between the human body inside and the force outside was less substantial than any measurement would confirm. It was a sound that made shelter feel like a pretense. She understood, sitting in the dark with her back against 3 feet of solid sandstone, why people left their shelters during blizzards. Not because they were rational, because the sound made it feel as though there was no longer any difference between inside and outside, and the instinct to move, to do something, to find something better, became nearly impossible to resist. She did not move. After the first hour, she noticed something that changed her understanding of what was happening outside. The grass packed into the side gaps had stopped hissing. The thin, cold streams of air that had been finding the smallest imperfections in the wall had diminished and then ceased. Not because the wind had slowed, because the snow being driven against the exterior of the wall was filling the gaps from outside, plastering every remaining imperfection with a layer of wind-packed ice that sealed tighter than anything she could have constructed by hand. She sat with this for a moment. The storm that was trying to kill her was also in its fury completing her wall. Every minute of wind drove more snow against the wagon bed, against the canvas, against the grass-packed sides, building insulation outward from the structure she had built inward. The blizzard was working for her and against her simultaneously, and the net result hour by hour was incrementally in her favor. She had not planned for this. She could not have planned for it. but she recognized it immediately for what it was, a piece of luck that had not come from luck at all, but from the decision to use the right kind of shelter in the right kind of location. Because a hollow in an east-facing rock face in a northwest blizzard would always accumulate snow on its western exposure. And accumulated snow was insulation, and insulation was warmth retained, and warmth retained was time, and time was everything. She ate a piece of dried elk meat without tasting it and tucked the canteen back inside her coat against her body. By what she estimated was the third hour, the sound had changed. The roar had become a muffled howl, and the howl had softened further into a low moan that reached her as though filtered through great depth. The vibrations in the rock at her back had quieted. The cold inside the hollow was still serious, still deep, but it was stable. It was not increasing at the rate it had been in the first hour. The mule's body against the back wall was doing the arithmetic she had assigned it, producing heat in the still air, with a slow reliability she could feel through her coat. She had not intended to sleep. She did not make the decision to sleep. She simply became aware at some point between one breath and the next that she had been asleep, and that she did not know for how long. The sound was still there, reduced further, and the hollow was still dark, and she was still alive. And the mule was still breathing beside her with a patience that she found in that moment to be one of the most reassuring sounds she had ever heard. She sat up and checked the walls by touch. Wagon bed, cold and dry, canvas above rigid with ice set in place. The grass-packed sides frozen into a single compressed mass that had become its own kind of wall, not strong but airtight. She thought about Virgil Mace, not with fear, with the same methodical attention she had been applying to everything else. Virgil was somewhere on this trail with three men. She did not know where. She did not know whether he had found shelter before the storm hit or whether the storm had caught him in the open, and she sat in the dark for a while with both possibilities and found that she could not determine which outcome she wanted. She knew what she thought of Virgil Mace. She knew what he had done and what he intended and what the toolbox meant to him, which was nothing beyond its price in a San Francisco dealer's inventory. She knew that he was the kind of man who treated the possessions of dead people as opportunities. But she also knew that knowing all of that did not make it easy to want someone to freeze to death on a ridge in Wyoming. She thought about Neva Colston alone in the trading post at Powder River. She thought about the leather scrap in her coat pocket, the drawing made without hesitation, the information given freely in the way that certain people give information, not as generosity exactly, but as a kind of professional obligation. The way a doctor gives a diagnosis even when the news is not good. Neva had sent her here, and Virgil Mace was 2 days behind on the same road. She pressed her back against the sandstone and listened to the storm, and did not sleep again for a long time. The blizzard lasted 19 hours. She knew this not from a clock which she did not own, but from light. She had entered the hollow in the early afternoon with pale daylight, still filtering through the gaps she had not yet sealed. The gaps had closed, the daylight had gone, and for a long time there was nothing but darkness and the voice of the storm and the mule breathing beside her. Then at some point after she had slept and woken and slept again, a faint luminosity appeared along the top edge of the canvas where the frozen shell had cracked slightly as the snow above it settled and shifted. That was dawn. The glow strengthened slowly, a gray-white seepage that came through the ice-hardened fabric in a way that was less like light than like the memory of light, just enough to separate the outline of the mule from the back wall, just enough to see her own hands when she held them in front of her face. The hands were chapped and split at the knuckles, and the right palm had a rope burn she had not registered acquiring. They were still attached. They were still working. She considered this adequate. The sound was gone, not fading, not diminishing. Gone in the way that presence becomes absence between one moment and the next, a shift so complete that the silence it left felt structural, as though the quiet were holding something up. She had heard silences before the silence of very early mornings, before any animal had stirred the silence of a room after someone has just left it for the last time. This was not those silences. This was what remained when the loudest thing in 100 miles had exhausted itself and departed. It was the silence of a landscape that had been completely remade overnight and had not yet decided what it was going to do next. She sat in it for a long time, listening for the specific absence of wind gusts, the sign of a lull, rather than a true end. She had learned this from her father as well. The patience to wait for certainty when certainty was available because the cost of acting on a lull, as though it were a conclusion, was the kind of cost you only paid once. When she was certain, she began to dig. The snow outside the hollow had drifted to nearly 4 feet against the wagon bed, and the surface beyond was an unbroken white plain that erased every feature of the terrain she had crossed the previous day. The trail was gone. The scrub vegetation was gone. The world had been smoothed into a single featureless expanse that extended to a horizon almost indistinguishable from the pale sky above it. She dug the gap at the right end of the wagon bed, clear of packed snow, and led the mule out into the white. The animal stood blinking in the light, its breath rising in slow columns that hung in the still air without moving. There was no wind. The air was perfectly, impossibly still, and in that stillness, the cold that pressed against her face and moved into her lungs with each breath was a different kind of cold than what the storm had carried. It was static. Cold, cold that sat where it was placed rather than hunting. Sharp and clean present, impatient, the cold of a world that had paused between one state and the next and was waiting to see what would happen. She turned and looked at what she had built. From outside, it was almost invisible. The wagon bed was buried to its upper edge in drifted snow, only the topmost inch of the sideboard showing above the white surface. The canvas above was encased in a smooth shell of ice that had conformed to the rock face behind it as though poured there deliberately. The grass-packed gaps on either side had disappeared entirely under compacted snow. It looked like a natural feature of the bluff, a place where stone and winter had always met in exactly this configuration. If she had come upon it without knowing what it was, she would have walked past it. She stood there in the silence, in the cold and the white, and looked at it for a long time. It was not strong, it was not engineered. It was a broken wagon bed dragged into a hollow in a rock face and sealed with dead grass and a wool blanket and packed earth and the blizzard's own snow driven against it from the outside. The rope was fraying where it had been cut. The canvas was still torn. None of it had been designed for what she had asked it to do, and none of it had needed to be. It had needed only to be complete. Complete was the thing. A weak wall with no gaps would always outperform a strong wall, with one because the wind did not attack walls. It found openings. The 4 days between the hollow and Buffalo were navigated by sun. The trail was buried under drifts that rendered every landmark useless. And so she followed the arc of the sun south and slightly east, trusting direction when she could not trust the ground covering ground by compass. Point when there was no other reference available. The mule was gaunt but sound. She was frost-scarred and thin in the way that comes from burning reserves without replacing them, the particular leanness of sustained effort in sustained cold. On the second day out from the hollow on a stretch of high ground that gave her a long view to the north and west, she stopped. There was a group moving in the middle distance, perhaps half a mile out. 3 horses and a small wagon heading north back the way she had come. She watched them long enough to identify the direction and the pace, both of which were the pace and direction of men who had changed their minds about something. One of the horses carried a rider with a particular way of sitting upright and slightly forward, the posture of a man accustomed to surveying what was in front of him as though it were property he had not yet acquired. She recognized the strip of red leather on the saddle behind the cantle, the custom work from the billing saddler that Neva had described with the precision of a trained observer. Virgil Mace was going home. She watched until the group moved behind a rise and disappeared. She did not know why he was going back. She did not know what had happened between him and Neva Colston at the Powder River trading post, or whether the blizzard had simply recalculated his odds in a way that made the pursuit no longer rational. She would not know the answer until she reached Buffalo and Vidar told her. She picked up the mule's lead and kept moving south. Vidar Ashford was 38 years old and had been in Wyoming territory for 6 years, long enough to have learned that this country kept its own calendar and that the plans men made against it were suggestions rather than schedules. He had built his homestead near Buffalo with the systematic patience that ran in the family, the same patience that had built boats in Lofoten and a life in the Gallatin Valley, and he had been running it alone since his wife had gone back east 2 years earlier to care for her mother and had written a letter the following spring that was kind and clear and final. He had received word of the blizzard from a rider passing through 3 days after it hit. The rider had come from the north and had reported what he had seen, which was the evidence of the storm's reach along the Bozeman Trail, including two men found frozen against their horses 11 miles north of Buffalo, their bodies rigid enough that the recovery party had needed to lay them flat in a wagon like planks of wood. The writer had said that no other travelers were known to have been on the trail between the Tongue River and the Powder River crossing when the storm hit, and that the trail itself was buried under drifts that would not clear before April. Vidar had spent those 3 days doing what he did with most things that he could not act on, which was to set them aside in a part of his mind reserved for facts not yet resolved and turn his attention to the work that was in front of him. He had finished chinking the north wall of the barn. He had repaired the gate latch on the livestock pen. He had split 2 cords of wood and stacked it against the shed wall. He had done these things with the focused efficiency of a man who understood from a lifetime of watching his father and then his sister that the way through impossible grief was not around it, but through the hands, through the specific and demanding work of keeping things alive and in order. On the morning of the 4th day after the storm, he was in the yard carrying water from the well when he looked up and saw her. She was coming in from the north road, a small figure against the white leading a mule on a rope. She was wearing the same coat she had left Billings in and carrying a leather satchel over one shoulder and a cast-iron Dutch oven in her free hand. She was walking at the deliberate fuel-conserving pace of someone who had been walking a long time and had learned not to waste motion on urgency when urgency was no longer the relevant variable. Vidar set the water bucket down. He stood in his yard and watched her come across the last 100 yards. And he did not call out, and he did not go to meet her. Not because he did not want to, but because his legs were not entirely doing what he asked of them. And also because there was something about the way she was moving, steady and direct, and already past the worst of it, that told him she did not need to be met. She was arriving. That was different from needing to be rescued. She came through the gate and stopped a few feet from him. He looked at her hands chapped and split. He looked at her face windburned and drawn. He looked at the mule gaunt and patient. Then he went inside and she followed him. He sat her by the stove and put water on and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and did not ask anything for a while. This was the right thing, and they both knew it without having to establish it. They had grown up in the same house with the same father who had understood that the period immediately after something difficult was not the time for questions. When she was warm enough to talk, she told him, not everything at once, in the order that things had happened with the same flat specificity their father had used to describe anything worth describing. The back room at Mason Sons and what she had understood when Virgil's eyes settled on the toolbox. The road north from Billings and the axle getting worse. Neva Colston at the Powder River trading post in the leather scrap and what Neva had told her about the man who had come through asking questions. The morning of the 6th day and the sky pressing down from the northwest. The hollow in the sandstone bluff and what she had built inside it. Vidar listened without interrupting. He had always listened this way, with the whole of his attention, the way their father had listened, as though what was being said was the only thing that mattered until it was finished. When she was done, he was quiet for a while, looking at his hands on the table. Then he told her about Virgil Mace. Virgil and his men had reached the Powder River trading post the night before the storm hit. They had come in from the north, moving fast, covering ground, the way men covered ground when they were trying to close a gap before conditions changed. Neva Colston had been there. She had given them shelter because she would have given shelter to anyone in that situation, which was a matter of principle rather than preference. During the 19 hours of the blizzard in the close quarters of the Powder River trading post, with the storm doing what it did to the sense of what was possible and what was not, Neva Colston had talked to Virgil Mace. She had not argued with him. She had not threatened him. She had not made any appeal to his better nature, which she had assessed within the first hour of his arrival as a nature that did not contain a better portion worth appealing to. What she had done was simpler and in the end more effective. She had told him what she had seen in 23 years of frontier life. She told him about the two men found 11 miles north of Buffalo, the ones who had gone rigid against their horses. She described it with the clinical precision of a woman who had spent 2 years among the war wounded of the Army of the Potomac. The specific details that made abstraction impossible, what the cold did to the extremities first, and then to the core, how long it took, what a man looked like at the end. She described the men she had known personally who had gone out on roads they had calculated as manageable and had not come back, and what had been found later and where. She did not mention Sigrid, She did not mention the toolbox. She did not connect any of it explicitly to the situation Virgil was in or the decision he had made to follow a woman on a wagon alone through November in Wyoming territory. She simply described the landscape he was in and what it did to people who misjudged it. By the morning the storm cleared, Virgil Mace had packed his men and turned north. Vidar paused at the end of this. He looked at Sigrid across the table and said that the writer who had brought him this account had mentioned one additional detail. He said that Neva Colston, when asked later why she had told those particular stories in that particular way, had said only that she had been a nurse long enough to know that the best treatment for a certain kind of man was not argument or force, but a clear and accurate description of the consequences of the condition he was in. Sigrid sat with this. She thought about Neva alone at the Powder River trading post with Virgil Mace and three of his men, with a blizzard making the walls shake using nothing more than the truth told precisely. No weapon, no authority, no leverage beyond the weight of what she actually knew. She thought about what that required. Vidar said, "How did you know it would hold the shelter?" Sigrid considered the question honestly, the way she considered all questions. She said she had not known. She had known that doing nothing was a certainty. She had known that doing something was a probability. She had chosen the probability. Vidar looked at the fire for a while. Then he said something that he had been thinking about for 4 days since the writer had come through with the news of the trail and the two men found frozen, and his sister somewhere between here and there, with no way to know which side of the accounting she was on. He said that he had thought about going out to find her. He had stood in the doorway of this house when the first rumors of the storm reached him, and he had looked north, and he had calculated the odds of finding one person in that much white, and he had not gone. He had stayed and split wood and chinked walls and waited. And he said that staying had been one of the hardest things he had ever done, and that he was not entirely certain it had been right, and that he had been carrying that uncertainty for 4 days, and he wanted her to know it. Sigrid looked at her brother. He was a man who did not speak about difficulty unless it was specific, and this was specific. She said, "You would not have found me. I was under 4 feet of snow in a hole in a rock that looked like the rock itself. You would have ridden past it 3 times and not seen it." Vidar nodded. He knew this was true. It did not entirely resolve the thing he was carrying, and she did not expect it to. Some things were not resolved by being true. They were only witnessed. They sat by the stove for a long time without talking, the way they had sat as children in the house in the Gallatin Valley when their father was working late, and the evening had gone quiet, and there was nothing required of them except to be in the same room and be warm. Outside, the snow that had buried the Bozeman Trail was settling into the shapes it would hold until April. The hollow in the sandstone bluff 55 miles to the north was already indistinguishable from the surrounding rock, its improvised wall buried, and invisible the wagon bed entombed in a drift that would not release it until the first serious thaw. The following spring, a party of Army surveyors working the route between Fort Keogh and Fort McKinney came across the remains. The man who found it first was a young corporal named Ferris, 28 years old from Ohio, who had been assigned to the survey detail because of his facility with written records and his habit of noticing things that other men walked past. He had been cataloging abandoned structures for 3 weeks, and he had developed a sense for the difference between things left behind by accident and things built with intent. He stood at the mouth of the hollow for several minutes. The wagon bed was half buried in the remnant drift, the top edge of the sideboards, just clearing the snow line. The canvas above was still intact across most of its span, frozen stiff and gray-white, conforming to the rock face it had been pressed against by the weight of a winter's worth of accumulation. The grass packed into the side gaps had frozen solid months earlier and was still compressed into the crevices with a density that suggested it had been placed there under significant pressure and with significant care. Corporal Ferris did not know whose it was. He did not know when it had been built, or under what circumstances, or whether the person who built it had survived the building of it. He wrote in his survey notes, "Abandoned structure, unknown origin, unknown purpose. Section 14, Township 52, North Range 83 West." He noted the materials, the orientation, the apparent construction method. Then before he remounted and moved on, he did something that was not in the survey protocol. He placed his palm flat against the back wall of the hollow against the sandstone itself and held it there for a moment. The rock was cold, completely, absolutely cold. The cold of stone that had spent a winter buried under snow and ice, and the residual force of a blizzard that had killed at least 2 people and probably more on the road to the north. But it was dry, perfectly dry, as though the space it enclosed had been protected from moisture, as well as from wind sealed so completely that even the seepage of melt had not found its way inside. He took his hand away. He mounted his horse. He moved on down the trail toward Fort McKinney, where there was a ledger waiting for his notes and a fire waiting for the colt he was carrying. He did not know that the hollow had held one woman, one mule, and the better part of 2 days through the worst blizzard on the northern Wyoming plain since 1881. He did not know about the rope harness cut into raw shoulders, or the knots tied by touch in the dark, or the grass packed by hands that had stopped feeling like hands an hour before the work was finished. He did not know about the toolbox opened in the darkness, or the tears that were not grief, or the specific quality of silence that follows 19 hours of sound. He only knew that someone had built something and that it had worked. The hollow stood through 3 more winters before the wagon would rotted through and the canvas finally gave way entirely and the rope returned to the soil. The sandstone walls remained exactly as they had always been shaped by wind over 10,000 years into a curve that faced east. The hollow that Sigrid Ashford had chosen because of the direction it faced, in the depth of its recession, in the solidity of its 3 existing walls became, after the 4th wall fell away, simply a hollow in a rock face again. A natural feature of the landscape, a place where stone met weather on the stone's own terms. The story of what she had done traveled the way stories traveled in that country, from mouth to mouth, and stove to stove, gaining and losing details with each telling, but keeping the essential shape. A woman alone on the Bozeman Trail, a storm that found everyone else it was looking for, a wrecked wagon and a hole in the rock, and 4 days of silence afterward. The people who heard it and remembered it did not remember it because the method was complicated. They remembered it because it was not. Nothing in it required tools she did not have or knowledge she had not already been given. Nothing required anything beyond the willingness to look at what was already there, damaged and ordinary and never designed for this, and to see it not for what it was, but for what it could become when every gap was sealed. If you have stayed with this story to its end, then perhaps you have recognized something in it that is not about blizzards or wagon beds or the winter of 1887. Perhaps you have recognized the specific shape of a moment when the thing you built your life around is no longer available to you in the form you built it, and what remains is scattered and broken and looks from certain angles like nothing at all. The career you spent 30 years building, the person you built it alongside who is gone now either by death or distance or the slow erosion of things that seem permanent. The version of yourself that knew exactly what came next and had a plan for it, standing somewhere back along the road behind you with a cracked axle and a torn canvas. The storm does not ask what the plan was. It asks only whether the walls are complete. And the walls do not need to be what you designed. They do not need to be strong. They do not need to be made from the right materials or assembled in the right sequence or built by someone who knew what they were doing when they started. They need to be complete, sealed at every gap, closed against the thing that is looking for a way through. Because what the storm is looking for is not an opening it has to force. It is looking for one you left by accident or by exhaustion or by the mistaken belief that a small gap in a large wall is effectively the same as no gap at all. It is not. A wall with one opening is not 3/4 of a wall. It is an invitation. Close the gaps with whatever you have, with what is broken and what is salvaged and what was never meant for this but is here and available and can be made to serve if you are willing to ask it to. The storm passes. It has always passed. The evidence of this is in every person who has ever come through the worst of something and stood in the silence afterward, frost-scarred and thin, leading whatever they had left across whatever came next. Not because they were stronger than the storm, because they were complete.